Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. The war drags on and the uncertainty grows. That's the best way to explain what's been happening back here in Israel when it comes to the Gaza Strip. Will Israel expand this operation into Gaza City, where the tanks are now encircling, or will it pull away and go into negotiations with Hamas, which now seems to be willing to reach some sort of partial deal, a release of some of the hostages in exchange for a ceasefire and continued negotiations? On the one hand, that was something that Netanyahu had wanted. Now suddenly, while Hamas says it agrees to that type of deal, Netanyahu says he only wants a complete deal, one that sees the release of all the hostages in an exchange for potential end of the war. And what does that mean for his coalition with Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir? What's happening in the Security Cabinet, where IDF Chief of Staff Eyal Zamir continues to knock his head against the wall or against some of the other ministers who are putting pressure on him to expand the operation, and where he apparently is arguing, no, now is the time actually to reach a deal that ends in a ceasefire and stops the war. And of course, politically, what does this mean for Netanyahu as he sees on the horizon the next election? When is it coming? In October of 2026 or potentially earlier? And would he prefer to have the hostages home, or does he prefer not to lose the right-wing voters? All of these questions and many more are discussed on today's episode with my JPPI colleague Shmuel Rosner, journalist, author, and commentator on everything that has to do with Israel, its relations with the United States, and of course, what is happening in this war and what is happening inside Netanyahu's head. We try to break it down and give some answers, although both of our forecasts are that while it's cloudy today, it will continue to be cloudy in the weeks to come. Stay with us. Shmuel, it's great to have you back on the podcast. And as we were just talking before I pressed the record button, where are we going? Where are we heading? What's happening is shrouded in a cloud of uncertainty, which is not very different than many other weeks that you and I have spoken over the past almost 2 years now since the 7th of October, and really trying to figure out what are the next steps and what's going to happen in this crazy chain of events. I mean, if you just look at the headlines over the last couple of days, right? Tanks on the outskirts of different parts of Gaza City, the IDF Chief of Staff, Eyal Zamir, once again, of course, under attack within the cabinet, but saying, take the deal. If there is a deal, it's better than the other option of going into Gaza. And the prime minister, where he's always been pretty much throughout this war, is if I borrow from the Yiddish phrase for a moment, nicht hier, nicht dahein, right? Neither here nor there. Does he want the deal? And then in that deal, does he want a full deal, a deal that gets back all hostages, or a partial deal that gets back some hostages and sees a ceasefire for a period of time? Or does he just want to buy more time and actually go forward with the military pressure? And then I'll just add in the other dimension, which, you know, the opponents of the prime minister tend to, I think, overstep or ignore, is that, yes, military pressure does have an impact on Hamas. And the fact that Israel is saying and building up that tank column and those forces around different parts of Gaza City is probably what gets Hamas to ease up its demands, to be more flexible, and to be willing to even take a partial deal. So you can't ignore one without the other. You can't just look at one part of the picture through one dimension. But it does still leave us with the big question, what is going to happen?
Right. And we must pretend that we know what's going to happen.
Exactly. That's the purpose
otherwise
of us being here.
There's no show. Right. So let's try to do it by, as an item by item conversation. I'll start with Netanyahu. If you wanna give him credit, you'll say this is his always had been his strategy, to decide at the last minute, to see where things are going, to open as many options as possible until the last minute, and only then, when he realizes that there's nothing more to gain from still waiting, only then he makes a decision. That's of course the positive or the the positive interpretation of his conduct. The other option is that he can decide, or that because of political pressure he can decide that he wants to make the deal, but he's afraid to lose his coalition, that he wants to accept the recommendations of the military, but he cannot do it without angering the right wing of his own party and some other parties.
And therefore he does what he's often done in the past, is buy time, right?
Buy time, yeah, exactly. Buy time. Don't decide, just buy time. It's already late August, and he's still going. There's only a year and 2 months until the actual original date of election day. So the more time he buys, the more time he gets to be prime minister before he must face the voters. And we know that, at least according to current polls, the voters aren't quite enthusiastic about a repeat of the current government. So that's Netanyahu. He's waiting for something, and it cannot be clear for us if this is because of strategic reasons or because of political reasons. It is probably a mix of both. It is probably some of this and some of that. Second item is the item of the deal. We don't know if there's a deal, and if there is a deal, what are the details of the deal? Because saying, okay, Hamas is willing to have a deal, what does it entail? If the deal means, release all hostages and we get some prisoners and the IDF gets to keep the perimeter around Gaza as a security buffer zone, that's one thing. If the deal means Hamas stays in power, all Hamas terrorists are released, including those who participated in the October 7th attack, there's no perimeter, etc., that's a totally different deal. So for Netanyahu to accept a deal, it needs to be acceptable. It needs to be acceptable to him, to at least some of his coalition members, if not all of them. It needs to be acceptable to the public. The fact that the public is now demonstrating for a deal without looking at the actual details, we all want a deal. If it's a good deal.
But the public does show, and we show this in different polling that you oversee here at JPPI, is that the public overwhelmingly supports a deal, even if it means, well, overwhelmingly might be a stretch, but the public does support a deal, even if it does mean an end to the war. We start to get a little complicated. Does it mean Hamas remains in power? Does Hamas not remain in power? But I think, right, correct me if I'm wrong, when we pose the question, take the deal, end the war, most of the public wants that deal.
It's most of the public. It's about half and half within the Jewish public. So you have the clear support of the vast majority of the 20% Arab population. And then you have the Jews split about half and half when the question we presented was a clear-cut choice between all the hostages back, but Hamas stays in power and end to the war, or continuing the war and the hostages aren't coming back. So when you face such clear choice, this is where the public stands. Then again, there are more components to a deal. Let's say a deal includes a situation in which Israel must release, the perpetrators of the October 7th massacre.
Which there are apparently several hundred that Israel has.
Is the public going to accept such a deal? Well, I'm not so sure. Saying Hamas to remain in power, that's something that's quite vague. What does it mean? Okay, they stay in power in Gaza. We don't want to control Gaza anyhow. But to release the perpetrators of a massacre of Israelis, that's going to be very tricky. So again, whether Netanyahu is making the right choice on the deal or the wrong choice on the deal much depends on the details of the deal, and we don't have the exact details. And the details keep changing, because if Israel accepts it, then Hamas, adds some additional components or demands to the deal. If Israel does not accept it, Hamas is willing to compromise. This changes from day to day or from week to week, and we must be careful when we say that there is a deal on the table that Israel can actually accept.
One of the issues, obviously, that comes out, and I don't know, I'm curious your thoughts on this. How much should the government be sharing with the public the details of the deal, as an example, right? There was a episode last week on the investigative reporting TV show on Channel 13, one of the big TV channels in Israel, called HaMakor, which in English is The Source, by acclaimed Israeli journalist Raviv Drucker, really one of the leading investigative reporters in this country, and a very vocal critic of Netanyahu for many, many years, brought on members and past members of the hostage negotiation team, one in particular, and really kind of brought the inside scoop, so-called, of what was happening inside there, and how at the end of the day, you watch the episode and you walk away with the sense that politics have overtaken the conversations and the negotiations, that what's leading the prime minister and the cabinet is not the best interest of the hostages. There were multiple deals that were possible to be made along the way, and Netanyahu blocked them for different variety of reasons. I personally did hear in the piece, they do mention Brett McGurk, the former hostage coordinator, but his official title, coordinator for Middle East and Africa in the National Security Council of the Biden administration, who said last September, so just a couple months before ending up his term in office with the Biden presidency, was that Hamas never really said no to a deal. And Drucker, even in a piece in Haaretz on Monday morning, basically says, I'm not sure how much McGurk was accurate in his description. Basically what I'm getting at here for a moment, and then getting back to the Makor episode, you'll have the Netanyahu supporters will say, well, those guys are just left-wing conspirators who want to bring down the prime minister, right? In other words, in this issue, which has become so highly politicized, it's very difficult to even know what's happening, because tell me who you vote for or tell me what side of the political spectrum you're on, and I can pretty much guess, unfortunately. Do you support this way? Do you support that way? And who do you think is to blame? And who's really at fault? I mean, it's really difficult to even know what's true here.
You're correct, and I think there are two elements here that must be considered. One is that there can be a real debate on whether Israel need to accept a certain deal. Some people might say, well, I'm willing to release, let's say, 2,000 prisoners for the hostages. And the other person might say, well, no more than 1,000. And that's a real debate that people can have within the cabinet or outside of the cabinet. And the fact that Netanyahu does not agree with his opponents on the exact details to which Israel must agree, that's the role of the government, to set the terms and to decide which terms are acceptable to Israel and which are not. So that's one part of the issue. The other part of the issue, and that's where it gets very troubling, is the issue of trust. Because so many Israelis have so little trust in the good intentions of the government, it doesn't really matter what the government says. If the government says, well, Hamas did not accept a deal that could be tolerable to most Israelis, many Israelis say, well, we don't believe you. We don't believe you. We don't believe the prime minister. We don't believe the cabinet. We don't think they're telling us the truth. And that's why many Israelis tend to think that behind closed doors, there is a deal that Israel could take, but Netanyahu doesn't take it for political reasons. So again, whether it's this, whether the actual consideration of the cabinet is ideological or strategic considerations or political consideration, that's something that's very difficult to know in the current atmosphere, because as you said, the critics of the government, they want the hostages back. They also want the government out. The opponents of a deal, they say, well, there is no actual deal to be had. We were never close to anything that could be acceptable to Israel as a country, as a society. And all the critics, all they want is us out. So that's the reason for the criticism. And again, for us outsiders, observers, even though both of us speak with many, we speak to officials and to cabinet members, etc., you talk to them and you still get a picture that is more like a Rorschach test than anything else.
Exactly.
Tell me who you believe, and I'll tell you what you think.
But also, do you agree with me? Because I've long believed this, but I've had people who have not agreed with me that Netanyahu. I mean, there's a lot we could say about him: cynical, prolonging the war, prioritizing politics over what's right for the country. A lot of this is true. A lot of it is sometimes exaggerated. But at the end of the day, if he's going to a new election, he doesn't want hostages. Even if we go down the route of he's only motivated by politics. He doesn't want hostages in Gaza when he's going to an election.
That's true, but he also doesn't want to see the right-wing part of the public separated from him and announcing that he lost the war. It's a tricky situation for Netanyahu. Again, the polls doesn't show him and his current coalition winning the next round of election. And that's why he doesn't want to go to a new election in the current situation. He wants to do something to reshuffle the cards before an election. Now, reshuffling the cards can mean a deal and the hostages back and some kind of ending to the war, or maybe a continuation of the war in an attempt to achieve something that looks more like a victory over Hamas, to destroy some more parts of the Gaza Strip, to get more Hamas operatives killed, maybe bring them back to the negotiating table, more humble, more willing to accept a deal that Israel can take. These are the two options. Right now, he's in a position where he gets criticism from the so-called center left for not taking the deal, and he's also criticized by the right-wing part of his coalition for not being aggressive enough in pursuing the continuation of the war in Gaza. And he has to juggle between these two positions and somehow make a decision. And for now, we only see him postponing. So they made the decision to go into Gaza. I think they were serious about the decision, but the decision was not immediately enacted. It's a process. We need to prepare the military. We need to send...
Which is him buying time again. That's the buying time part.
So all the miluimnikim, all the reservists are going to only report to duty in early September. Then you have to train them, prepare them. So we are talking about a few more weeks before the IDF actually goes into Gaza. If nothing stops Israel from doing that, if the terms of the deal are not acceptable to Netanyahu, then Israel will ultimately make that move. But it's a highly controversial move, both within and outside of Israel. And I think Netanyahu is still looking for a way out of it, if there's such way that will not humiliate him as a leader.
Let's talk a moment about Eyal Zamir, the IDF chief of staff. We've spoken about him in the past. He was appointed by Netanyahu. He was Netanyahu's military secretary back, I think, 2017 to 2020, head of the Southern Command, deputy chief of staff. Then he did not get the chief of staff role. Instead, Herzi Halevi won out and took over that position in January of 23. Of course, what happened in October. Eyal Zamir was made the Director General of the Defense Ministry at the time. So he was like the highest civilian, professional civil servant role within the Defense Ministry. Once Herzi was kind of resigned, pushed out, however you want to refer to it, Eyal Zamir was brought back, and Netanyahu celebrated the moment, saying, I wanted to appoint you twice before. I wasn't able to. I finally was able to do it on the third time. He quoted from the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, a verse that says, Et HaZamir Higia, the time of singing. That is what the time of song, that is what his name translates that.
Well, Zamir is a singing bird.
It's a singing bird.
It's
exactly.
a type of a bird.
The time of a singing bird has come. And Zamir now is the chief of staff. But ever since he's been in this role, we've only seen clashes between Zamir, definitely Israel Katz, the defense minister, who's more of a puppet than a decision maker when it comes to how decisions are made within the country, but clashing with him all the time over professional appointments, military appointments, and promotions within the IDF, but also about decisions. He's been accused of stalling, of acting against the government, but even Netanyahu clashes with him. But we see that Zamir within the cabinet stands his ground, right? And basically keeps on the same line and the same position of take the deal. The army is worn down. There's fatigue. You mentioned the reservists. I was talking with someone yesterday, called up again for another 10 weeks in September. Forget about school year. If you're in university, forget about work, right? Forget about your family. This is just how it is. The army is worn down. And then there's the question really of the effectiveness of an operation. Will it achieve any of its goals anyhow? There's putting the hostages' lives at risk. But Zamir stands his ground. What do you make of him in being kind of this other opposing or resisting force within the cabinet to what the government wants to do?
Well, he's the adult in the room. He's a general with a backbone. I must say that, throughout the war, even though the war started with, because of a disastrous performance of the IDF, since the start of the war, we were able to witness that within the military, there are still many people who are highly capable, who are principled, who are dedicated, who are willing to put their lives on the line in many ways, and to also put their credibility, their are willing to stand up to the shifting winds of political considerations, of hysterics, of cookie ideas, etc.,
especially
etc.
those by the far right, the Smotrich Ben-Gvir flank within the cabinet.
They are the people, and I think Zamir knows this. They are the people who must keep the eye on the ball in both senses, both to keep the eye on the ball when it comes to executing the war, but their other mission is to keep the IDF together, to keep the IDF operational, efficient, to keep it going. And the IDF is a people's army. They cannot
and if the people feel that it's going in a different direction, they won't come. That's it.
Exactly. When you depend on so many reservists, when you depend on the goodwill, and again, the dedication of so many soldiers and junior officers, etc., you must remember that you have the responsibility to look these people in the eye and tell them, I did everything I could do to protect you. I did all the necessary preparations. I stood up to the political leadership when it proposed ideas that were not ideal or reasonable. You can trust me. For Eyal Zamir to be trusted by the officers and the soldiers is currently more important for him than to be trusted by the cabinet. Because the cabinet, let's tell the truth, the cabinet cannot do much Eyal Zamir. It's their general. They
No,
cannot.
100%. But I wonder in just taking what you're saying to another level. And God, I'm not that I'm advocating this at all. God forbid. But the military is very powerful in the country, right? And the reservists are very powerful. And if you had, for example, a movement of reservists in a big way, in a big number that said, listen, Ad Khan, until here, we're not willing to do this anymore. We're not willing to go into this Gaza City operation because we're endangering the lives of the hostages, because it's not going to achieve anything, because we've been doing the same thing for 2 years almost and we haven't achieved, because we don't yet know what the plan is on the day after on the political horizon. For whatever reason, this big contingent, if it's even possible for these people to come together, but let's say that for a moment, that would stop things in its tracks.
Well, a government at war must make sure that the public is behind it. This is true for all countries. It is more true for democratic countries, and it is even more true for democratic countries who rely on a people's army. That's the way it is. That's the rule of the game in Israel. You cannot execute a war without the support of the public. You can do it maybe for a few days, you can have a short operation, etc. But to have a war for 2 years without the support of the public, that is a very tricky thing to do. And you know, it's ultimately the responsibility of the government to be able to come to the public, explain itself, convince the public that a continuation of the war is the option that must be pursued. Otherwise, you'll see people either dragging their feet or avoiding service, or protecting themselves more than executing their actual tasks, etc.
On the battlefield,
and this is something that Zamir constantly remembers, and that the cabinet tends to forget. The current Israeli cabinet is a cabinet that has this, weird notion that, okay, we are the civilian leadership and we will just tell them what to do and they must do it, which in principle is true. But there's a new book that just came out by Professor Azar Gat. He's an Israeli professor of strategy. And in the book, he gives the following example. What if the Israeli cabinet orders the IDF to occupy China? Okay, this is your mission. Now go do it. And we are the leadership, and you must execute. Of course, it'll be ridiculous. So this whole notion, as if the civilian leadership is giving the orders and the IDF is just an executor of these orders, no matter how preposterous they are, that's something that doesn't stand the test of reality.
Right. I mean, that would apply, I guess, also to many democracies in the world. But you're 100% right that that tension is healthy also to some extent, right? In other words, we the people want to see some of that tension within the cabinet, because otherwise every prosperous idea and every crazy delusional plan would find its way into practice. Before I leave you, Shmuel, one last topic that I think we do need to mention here is the report that came out earlier this week, or the end of last week, by the United Nations, citing this new integrated food security phase classification, known by its acronym IPC, which I think most people probably, definitely in Israel, have not paid attention to, but it's the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, UNICEF, the UN, WFP, the World Food Program, WHO, the World Health Organization, all together have said that there's widespread starvation, destitution, there are preventable deaths, and basically Gaza is in a state of starvation. Of course, an actual famine. Famine has been confirmed in Gaza for the first time in this report. Now, as expected, the Israeli government, in its very pathetic way of trying to do public diplomacy over the last 2 years, which is pretty much nothing, pushed back on this report, claimed that it's false, it's not true, double standard, the United Nations can't be trusted. The IPC report has changed its criteria anyhow and lowered the standard to be able to include what's happening in Gaza when really it's not true. One of the ways and the criteria that you measure famine, for example, is measuring the actual arm circumference of children. How can we trust the measurements that are done by hospitals and nurses and medical staff in the Hamas-controlled territory of the Gaza Strip, and on and on and on. And actually, even the Prime Minister spoke about how 1 ton of aid has been inserted per civilian of Gaza since the beginning of the war, if you break it down. But that doesn't just include food, that also includes fuel. Okay. I mean, look, excuse me, you and I also here don't know what's real, what's true. We know one thing, though, that there is a crisis in Gaza. There are people who are starving. There are people who are suffering. They're not all bad guys. This will get worse, especially if Israel goes into Gaza City and moves the residents and the civilians of Gaza to try to put them in other parts of the Gaza Strip. Unclear exactly where and how, but let's run with that. The estimates are there's about 800,000, 700,000 people in Gaza City. But the Israeli people, and this is more what I want to talk about, because like myself, you're a veteran journalist and you're tapped in with the Israeli media, but also you're reading and talking to the international media. Israelis are pretty much, I don't want to say blind to what's happening on the other side, but not paying as much attention to it as the rest of the world is, for an example. I mean, how much of this should be part of the consideration? Should be part of, obviously in the cabinet, I'm sure they're talking about, do we have international support? Excuse me, do we not have international support? And the answer is we don't, except for Donald Trump at the moment. But what about the Israeli discourse? We don't hear about it in Israel. It's not a conversation in Israel. To me, that seems like, again, I've just long believed we could be just and legitimate and right in what we're doing, but we should know the full picture. And I feel like in this case, we, in other words, the people, don't know the full picture. We're not seeing everything for some reason. It's the media that's doing self-censorship. It's the government that kind of shoves things away. But the people don't really know what's happening.
Well, earlier I mentioned the lack of trust in the government when it comes to the hostage deal. You can apply the same explanation to the issue of hunger. Only in the issue of hunger, the people do trust the government, or if not the government, then the IDF. They do trust the IDF, and they have no trust in international organizations or in the international media. Israelis, by and large, don't believe these stories, and that's why they do not want to look at them with much attention, because they say, well, people are lying all over the world and trying to blame us for things that aren't true. There's nothing we can do about it except, protesting and saying it's not true. And as long as we keep the one international player that matters, which is Donald J. Trump, supporting us, we already lost the president of France. We already lost international crowds in in Indonesia or Belgium or Australia. As long as we have Trump supporting us, that's the only thing that matters.
And that is the wild card. Once Trump shifts on Israel, that's when we know war is over.
Sure. Yeah. There's no way around it. Look, Israel truly has no other supporters at the current time it can rely on except for Donald Trump. Then again, we say, okay, it's just Trump. Well, it's just the head of the most important empire. As long as he's supporting us, yes, we can ignore lesser countries, lesser leaders. We can say, well, they don't tell the truth. And in fact, on this matter, Trump is is with Israel not just because of strategic or tactical reasons. I think he's with Israel. His sentiment tends to be with Israel. He's also hostile to the UN. He also doesn't believe in those international humanitarian organizations. He also thinks this is all hypocritical machinations of international diplomacy, etc., etc. So at least on this matter, and at least for now, Israel does have the US administration backing it. And, we should say that the international criticism did result in a way in more aid to Gaza. So now, there's more aid going into Gaza. And, in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, it'll become almost ridiculous to say that Gaza is starving. It is drowning in aid.
Yeah.
How can it be starving? And if it's starving, it's not because of Israel, it's because of Hamas. So deal with Hamas, don't come to us and tell us that Gaza is starving.
And I think it also has to be said that Netanyahu's strategy has long been, okay, this is, as long as we have Trump, we're okay. The international community is anyhow against us. And once the war is over, we'll be able to climb back up that and regain some of that support as well. So another week and another moment in this war that just doesn't seem to have an ending.
Yeah, and it doesn't look as if this will not be our last conversation in which we say
exactly.
The situation is unclear. It's not as if it's unclear and we see that it's going to clear up in a week or two. It's going to take some time.
The forecast is cloudy.
For
the next few weeks as well. Shmuel, always great to have you on the show.
With some fog. Yeah.
Exactly, with some fog. Thank you very much for being with me. And to all our listeners and viewers, thanks for joining us. You can find us, as always, where podcasts can be found: Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and the website of Times of Israel. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI.